Boa tarde, meu amigo, minha amiga. Meu nome é Eduardo Favro e hoje teremos mais uma aula de Cálculo 2 para Engenharia de Agrimensura e Cartográfica. Quais são as dúvidas?
Para a gente colocar o trabalho lá no Teams, eu esqueci de finalizar lá, eu finalizei só hoje. Eu não sabia que tinha que finalizar, é alguma coisa assim?
Não sei, mas tudo bem. A gente vai aprendendo junto.
Ah, certo.
Mais alguma dúvida?
We are not our own masters. We are God's property. Is it not our happiness thus to view the matter? Is it any happiness or any comfort to consider that we are?
Alguma dúvida da lista?
It may be thought so by the young and prosperous.
Eu fiquei com dúvida na número 1, a função inversa, derivar a função inversa.
Certo. Alguma em particular ou as três?
As três.
As três. Você quer que eu resolva elas?
Pode resolver só uma, que aí eu entendo as outras.
No vídeo tem arco tangente e arco seno. Aquelas videoaulas que eu passei, correto? Então posso fazer da arco tangente?
Pode.
He feels in himself that radical sense of weakness, of listlessness, of discomfort, which accompanies the advance of age. And feeling thus, imagines himself merely swelling his fears with the notion that this distressing condition is due to some particular cause, from which, as from an illness, he hopes to recover.
Meu y arco secante de x.
That sickness is
Sei somente C, meu X.
And a horrible disease it is. They say that it is the fear of death
meu X
and of what comes after death that makes men turn to religion.
Y é arco cuja secante dá X. Então, secante de Y é X. Posso derivar?
The religious sentiment tends to develop as we grow older. To develop because as the passions grow calm, as the fancy and sensibilities are less excited and less excitable, our reason becomes less troubled and less obscured by the images, desires and distractions in which it used to be absorbed.
X' é
Whereupon
derivado da secante, secante de Y
our soul feels,
vezes tangente de Y multiplicado por dy sobre dx. Eu posso isolar meu dy sobre dx. Fica 1 sobre secante de Y tangente de Y. Até aqui, ok?
Something that will never play us false. A reality. An absolute.
Se eu pegar seno ao quadrado de x mais cosseno ao quadrado de x é igual a 1, não é? Que é a identidade fundamental. Se eu pegar e dividir por cosseno ao quadrado de x, todo mundo... Eu vou ter aqui, eu vou ter tangente ao quadrado de x mais 1 é secante ao quadrado de x. Ou a gente está trabalhando com y, tangente ao quadrado de y mais 1 é secante ao quadrado de y.
That we can be independent of
Aqui
God.
eu tenho uma secante de y. Secante de y eu sei que é x. Falta quem é a tangente de y. Então lá embaixo eu vou isolar a minha tangente de y. Tangente ao quadrado de y é secante ao quadrado de y menos 1. Então o que eu posso escrever que tangente de y é secante ao quadrado de y menos 1. O quadrado que estava na tangente passa para o outro lado como raiz. Tranquilo? Vocês estão muito quietos, gente.
Estamos acompanhando aqui, professor.
Y sobre dx é um sobre secante.
Now, how does he manifest himself now?
De y vezes tangente de y
as an absence, as though he weren't there at all. That's your fault.
Depois reescrever secante de y. Eu vou tirar a tangente e colocar a raiz. Secante ao quadrado de y menos 1 dentro da raiz. Certo? Então meu dy dx é um sobre. Secante de y é meu x, não é? Então fica x que multiplica a raiz. Secante ao quadrado vira x ao quadrado menos 1. Então, essa aqui é a derivada da minha arco secante. Derivada de arco x. Derivada do arco secante de x.
Finding bad reasons for what one believes for other bad reasons, that's philosophy.
É o meu
People
arco
believe in God because they've been
secante
conditioned
linha
to
de
believe
x.
in God. But all the same, insisted the savage,
Acompanharam?
it is natural to
Alguma
believe in
dúvida?
God when you're alone, quite alone in the night, thinking about death. But people never are alone now, said Mustafa Mon. We make them hate solitude.
Eu só não achei as videoaulas que você postou pra gente. Postou foi no Teams, né?
Foi. Uai. Agora que você vem falar isso?
Não, mas eu pesquisei no YouTube, só que eu achei umas outras funções inversas, não a de tangente, secante. E minha ficou errado.
Peraí, deixa eu... Vou abrir aqui meu Teams no navegador para falar onde está.
Certo.
You remember he's wounded, he's dying. Thou hast spoken right, 'tis true. The wheel has come full circle. I am here. What about that now? Doesn't there seem to be a God managing things, punishing, rewarding? Well, does there? Questioned the controller in his turn. You can indulge in any number of pleasant vices with a free martin, and run no risks of having your eyes put out by your son's mistress. Wheel has come full circle, I am here. But where would Edmund be nowadays? Sitting in a pneumatic chair with his arm round a girl's waist, sucking away at his sex hormone chewing gum, and looking at the feelies. The gods are just, no doubt, but their code of law is dictated in the last resort by the people who organize society. Providence takes its cue from men. Are you sure? Asked the savage. Are you quite sure that the Edmund in that pneumatic chair hasn't been just as heavily punished as the Edmund who's wounded and bleeding to death? The gods are just. Haven't they used his pleasant voices as an instrument to degrade him? Degrade him from what position? As a happy, hard-working, goods-consuming citizen, he's perfect. Of course, if you choose some other standard than ours, then perhaps you might say he was degraded. But you've got to stick to one set of postulates. You can't play electromagnetic golf according to the rules of centrifugal bumble puppy.
Se você
But value
ir no
dwells not in
general
particular
arquivos,
will, said the savage. It holds his estimate and dignity as well wherein 'tis precious of itself as in the prizer. Come, come.
pois, general não, vai em
That's going
materiais.
rather far, isn't it? If you allowed yourself to think of God,
Isto,
you wouldn't
materiais,
allow yourself to be
arquivos.
degraded by pleasant vices. You'd have a reason for bearing things patiently, for doing
Aí
things
aparece
with
roteiro
courage.
de
I've
videoaulas.
seen it with the Indians. I'm sure you have, said Mustafa Mon. But then we aren't Indians.
Ah, tá, achei aqui.
There isn't any
Obrigado.
need for a civilized
De
man
nada.
to bear anything that's seriously unpleasant.
Aí tem as
And as for
videoaulas,
doing
tem
things,
tudo que eu escrevo nessa aula, eu salvo em PDF e mando para vocês.
if men started doing things on their own.
Ok?
What about self-denial?
Ok.
If you had a God, you'd have a
Mas
reason
que
for
vocês têm de
self-denial.
dúvidas?
But industrial civilization is only possible when there's no self-denial. Self-indulgence up to the very limits imposed by hygiene and economics. Otherwise, the wheels stop turning. You'd have a reason for chastity,
Alô?
said the savage,
Alguém?
blushing a little as he spoke the words. But chastity means passion. Chastity means neurasthenia. And passion and neurasthenia mean instability. And instability means the end of civilization. You can't have a lasting civilization without plenty of pleasant vices. But God's the reason for everything noble and fine and heroic. If you had a God, my dear young friend,
Alô?
said Mustafa Mon, civilization has absolutely no need of nobility or heroism. These things are symptoms of political
dúvidas?
inefficiency. In a properly organized society like ours, nobody has any opportunities for being
Não
noble
precisa
or
ter vergonha
heroic.
de falar, não.
Conditions have got to be thoroughly unstable before the occasion can arise. Where there are wars, where there are divided allegiances, where there are temptations to be resisted, objects of love to be fought for or defended, there, obviously, nobility and heroism have some sense. But there aren't any wars nowadays. The greatest care is taken to prevent you from loving anyone too much. There's no such thing as a
Alô?
divided allegiance.
A atividade da lista que eu tive mais dúvida foi a 53.
And what you ought to do is on the whole so
53, ela é
pleasant.
pouco feia
So many
mesmo.
of the natural impulses are allowed
Quer que
free
eu faça
play
ela?
that there really aren't any temptations to resist.
Pode fazer ela,
And
por
if rather
favor.
by some unlucky chance,
Quem
anything
tá falando?
unpleasant should somehow
A Isabela.
happen, why, there's always
Isabela,
Soma
ok,
to
Isabela.
give you a holiday from the facts.
Então,
And there's always Soma to calm your
F de
anger,
T
to reconcile you to your enemies,
é
to
a
make you
raiz
patient and long-suffering. In
elevado
the
a T
past,
menos
you could
1
only accomplish these things by
dentro
making
da
a great
raiz
effort,
sobre
and after
elevado a
years of
T
hard
mais
moral
1
training. Now, you swallow 2 or 3 half-gram tablets, and there you are.
dentro da
Anybody can be
raiz.
virtuous now. You can carry at least
Ok.
half your morality about in a bottle.
Acho que o
Christianity
jeito mais
without
fácil de
fear.
fazer isso
That's what Soma
é
is.
pegar,
But the tea is
colocar
necessary. Don't you remember what Othello said? If after every tempest came such calms, may
elevado
the
a T
winds
menos
blow till
1
they have wakened
sobre
death.
elevado a T mais
There's a
1
story one of the old Indians used to tell us about the girl
elevado a
of
meio.
Mataski. The young men who wanted to marry her had to do a morning's hoeing
Vocês
in her
conseguem
garden.
enxergar isso?
It seemed easy, but there were flies and mosquitoes.
Sim ou não?
magic
Rápido.
bugs. Most of the young men
Sim.
simply couldn't stand the biting and stinging.
Posso pra
But the one that
frente?
could, he got the girl.
Pode.
Charming. But in
Então posso
civilized
colocar meu
countries,
F
said the controller, you can have girls without hoeing
é
them.
igual
And there aren't any flies
a
or
U elevado a
mosquitoes to sting
meio,
you. We got rid of them all
e meu
centuries
U
ago.
é elevado a T menos 1 sobre elevado a T mais 1.
That's just like you.
Posso
Getting
calcular a
rid of
derivada de
everything
F em
unpleasant instead of
relação
learning
ao
to put up with it.
o expoente meio, U elevado a meio menos 1, e é isso. Então é 1 sobre 2, U elevado a menos meio.
You just abolish the slings and arrows. It's too easy.
1 sobre 2,
Thinking of his mother.
raiz de 1. O menos significa que vai para o denominador e o 2 significa que é a raiz quadrada. Tranquilo? Isso aqui é um quociente. Então eu quero fazer a derivada de U em relação a x. A regra do quociente, a derivada do primeiro vezes o segundo menos o primeiro vezes a derivada do segundo. Aqui derivada também.
Nothing cost enough here. $12.5 million, Henry Foster had protested when the Savage told him that. $12.5 million. That's what the new conditioning center cost, not a cent less. Exposing what is mortal and unsure
Tudo
to
isso
all that
dividido
fortune,
pelo
death,
segundo ao
and danger
quadrado.
dare, even for an eggshell. Isn't there something in that? He asked, looking up at Mustafa Mond. Quite apart from God. Oh, of course, God would be a reason for it. Isn't there something in living dangerously?
E elevado a t menos 1 linha.
Men and women must have
Fica
their
elevado a
adrenals
t.
stimulated from time to time.
Copio o segundo membro. Menos o
It's one of the
primeiro.
conditions of perfect health.
Vezes a derivada do
That's why we've
segundo, que
made the
também dá e
VBS
elevado a
treatment
t.
compulsory.
Dividido por e elevado a t menos
Violent
1
passion surrogate. Regularly,
ao
once a month.
quadrado.
We flood the whole system with adrenaline. It's the complete physiological equivalent of fear and rage. All the tonic effects of murdering Desdemona and being murdered by Othello without
E elevado a t
in the
vezes ele a t fica
I like the
e elevado a
inconveniences.
2t
We don't, said the controller.
mais e
We
elevado
prefer
a
to do
t
things comfortably.
menos e elevado a t vezes e elevado a t dá
I want poetry.
e
I want
elevado a
real
2t
danger. I want freedom.
menos com menos mais
I want sin.
e elevado
In
a
fact,
t.
said Mustafa Mond, you're claiming the right to be unhappy.
Professor, deixa eu te perguntar um negócio. Na parte de baixo lá é e elevado a t menos 1 ou mais 1?
Verdade, é mais um.
The right to have syphilis and cancer. The right to have too little to eat. The right to be lousy. The right to live in constant apprehension of what might happen tomorrow. The right to catch typhoid. The right to be tortured by unspeakable pains of
Aqui é um
every
elevado a
kind.
t, aqui é também. Um vai cortar com o outro. Sobra só
I claim them all,
os dois e elevado a
said the
t.
Savage at last. Mustafa Mond shrugged his shoulders. You're welcome, he said.
Fica
Chapter
2
18.
e elevado a t
The door was ajar.
dividido por e elevado a t
Drawn?
mais 1
From the bathroom came an
ao
unpleasant
quadrado.
and characteristic sound. Is there anything the matter?
Tá bom assim?
Helmholtz called. There was no answer.
Lembrando que isso aqui
The unpleasant sound
tudo
was repeated twice.
é meu du sobre dx.
Then, with a click, the bathroom door opened, and very pale, the Savage emerged. I say, Helmholtz exclaimed solicitously, you
Certo.
do look ill, John.
E
Did you
aqui
eat
eu
something
tinha
that
o
didn't agree
meu
with you? Asked Bernard.
df sobre du.
I ate civilization. What?
Então eu queria calcular a derivada
I
de
was
f.
defiled. And then, he added in a lower tone, I ate my own.
Que é a derivada em relação a t.
Yes, but what exactly?
Então eu vou
I
apagar
mean, just now
aqui.
you were. Now I'm
Colocar a
purified.
derivada de
said
1
the
em
Savage.
relação a
I
t.
drank some mustard and warm water. The others
E aqui
stared at him in
embaixo
astonishment.
também.
You mean to say that you were doing it on purpose?
derivada de U em relação a T.
He sat down and, sighing, passed his hand across his forehead. I shall rest for a few minutes.
Minha derivada de F em relação a T.
Well, I'm not
Derivada
surprised.
de F em relação a U.
After silence,
Vezes derivada de U
we've
em
come to say
relação a
goodbye,
T.
he went on in another tone. We're off
Derivada
tomorrow
de F
morning.
em relação a
Yes, we're off tomorrow.
U
Said
tá
Bernard,
aqui.
on whose face the savage remarked a
1
new
sobre 2
expression
raiz
of
de U.
determined resignation. And by the way, John,
1
he
sobre
continued, leaning forward in
2
his chair
raiz
and laying
de
a
U
hand on the savage's knee.
vezes a derivada de U em relação a T.
Everything that happened yesterday.
2 elevado a T
How ashamed,
sobre E elevado
he
a
went on,
T
in
mais
spite of
1
the unsteadiness of his voice.
ao quadrado.
How really? The savage cut him short, and taking his hand, affectionately pressed it. Helmholtz was
reescrevendo.
wonderful to me. Bernard
Derivada
resumed
de
after a
F
little
em
pause.
relação a
If
T.
it hadn't been for him, I should.
2 cancela com outro 2.
There was a
Fica E
silence.
elevado a T
In spite of their sadness, because of it even,
raiz
for their
de
sadness was
elevado
the
a T
symptom of their
menos
love for
1
one another.
sobre E elevado a T mais 1, que é
I
minha
went to see the
U, não é
controller
isso?
this morning, said the savage at last. What for? To
Vezes
ask if I mightn't go to the islands with
E
you.
elevado a T
And
mais
what did he
1
say? Asked Helmholtz.
ao
eagerly.
quadrado.
The savage shook his head.
E o traço da fração
He wouldn't let me.
aqui.
Why not? He said he wanted to go on.
Essa
but
raiz que está no
expand.
denominador,
I'm damned, the savage
eu
added with
posso
sudden
passar
fury.
multiplicando
I'm
pelo
damned, but I'll
inverso.
go on being experimented with. Not
Então
for all
fica
the
E elevado
controllers
a
in the
T
world. I shall go away
sobre E
tomorrow
elevado
too.
a T
But where?
mais 1
The others asked in unison. The savage
vezes
shrugged his shoulders. Anywhere, I don't
a
care.
raiz
So
de E
long as I can
elevado
be
a T
alone.
mais 1 sobre E
From
elevado a
Guildford, the
T
down line followed the Wey Valley to Godalming,
menos 1.
then over Milford and Whitley, proceeded to Hazelmere, and on through Petersfield towards Portsmouth. Roughly parallel to it, the up line passed over Worplesdon, Tongham, Puttenham, Elstead, and Greyshot. Between the Hogsback and Hindhead, there were points where the two
Entenderam?
lines were not more than 6 or 7 kilometers apart. The distance was too small for careless flyers, particularly at night when they had taken half a gram too much. There had been accidents.
Sim, entendi, obrigado.
Decided to deflect the up
Com
line a
alguma
few
dúvida ou
kilometers
tá
to the
tudo
west.
claro?
Between Greyshot and Tongham, four
Eu
abandoned
pensava que era mais difícil para fazer.
of the old Portsmouth to
Que a
London.
minha eu
verdade,
fiz,
se eu-
The skies above them were
você
sunny.
eu fiz
pegar
jogo uma
as
bagunça.
raízes, olhar as raízes como um quociente,
Hummed and roared.
vai ficar bem mais feio as
The savage had
contas.
chosen as his hermitage the old lighthouse which stood on the crest of the hill between Puttenham and Elstead.
Mas desse jeito fica bem
The building
tranquilo.
was of ferro concrete and in excellent condition. Almost too comfortable, the savage had thought, when he first explored the place. Almost too civilizedly luxurious. He pacified his conscience by promising himself a compensatingly harder self-discipline. Purifications the more complete and thorough. His first night in the hermitage was, deliberately, a sleepless one. He spent the hours on his knees praying,
Isso.
now to that
Que é a
heaven
resposta
from
que
which
está
the
no
guilty
livro.
Claudius had begged forgiveness. Now in Zuni to Awanewilona,
Mais alguma
now to
dúvida?
Jesus and Pukong, now to his own guardian animal, the eagle. From time to time he stretched out his arms as though he were on the cross, and held them thus through long minutes of an ache that gradually increased till it became a tremulous and excruciating agony. Held them in voluntary crucifixion.
Querem fazer mais
while he
exercício
repeated,
para
with
treinar?
clenched teeth, the sweat me now
O que vocês
pouring
querem
down his
fazer?
face. Oh, forgive me. Oh, make me pure. Oh, help me to be good. Again and again, till he was on the point of fainting from
O
the
senhor tá
pain.
falando de exercício da lista ou de algum outro tipo de
He
exercício?
felt he had earned the right to
Tanto
inhabit
faz,
the
se vocês
light.
quiserem.
Yes, even though there still was glass in most of the
Então faz a 23 para nós, fazendo favor. Muita gente teve dificuldade nela.
For the very reason why he had chosen the lighthouse had become almost instantly a reason for going somewhere else. He had decided to live there because the view was so beautiful, because from his vantage point, he seemed to be looking out on the incarnation of a divine being. But who was he to be pampered with the daily and hourly sight of loveliness? Who was he to be living in the visible presence of God? All he deserved to live in was some filthy sty, some blind hole in the ground. Stiff and still aching after his long night of pain.
Essa 23 aqui. F de θ igual a 2 cosseno de θ ao quadrado vezes seno de 2θ.
On the north, the view was bounded by the long chalk ridge of the Hogsback, from behind whose eastern extremity rose the towers of the 7 skyscrapers which constituted Guildford. Seeing them, the savage made a grimace. But he was to become reconciled to them in course of time, for at night they twinkled gaily with geometrical constellations, or else floodlighted, pointed their luminous fingers, with a gesture whose significance nobody in England but the savage now understood, solemnly towards the plumbless mysteries of heaven. In the valley which separated the Hogsback from the sandy hill on which the lighthouse stood, Puttenham was a modest little village 9 stories high, with silos, a poultry farm, and a small vitamin D factory. On the other side of the lighthouse, towards the south, the ground fell away in long slopes of heather to a chain of ponds. Beyond them, above the intervening woods, rose the 14-story tower of Elstead.
Vou chamar essa primeira parte de
Hindhead and Selborne invited the eye into a blue romantic distance.
E a segunda
but it was not
de
alone the distance that had attracted
H
the
de
savage to his
θ. Aqui
lighthouse.
também
The near was as
H de
seductive as the
θ.
far. The woods, the open stretches of heather and yellow gorse, the clumps of
Meu
Scotch
G de
firs,
θ
the shining ponds with
é
their
2
overhanging birch
cosseno
trees, their water lilies, their
de
beds
θ
of
ao
rushes.
quadrado.
These were beautiful and,
Vocês
to
conseguem
our
fazer
accustomed
isso
to
de
the aridity of
cabeça
the American desert,
ou
astonishing.
não?
And then, the solitude. Whole days passed during which he never saw a human being. The lighthouse was only a quarter of an hour's flight from the Charing T Tower, but the hills of Malpace were hardly more
Não lembro, não.
than this
Eu também não.
The crowds that daily left
Então,
London left it only
vou
to
chamar
play
o θ ao
electromagnetic
quadrado
golf
de
or
U,
tennis. Puttenham
2
possessed no
cosseno
limits.
de U.
The nearest Riemann surfaces were at Guildford.
Então, meu G
Flowers and a landscape
é
were
2
the only
cosseno
attractions
de U.
here. And so,
E U
as there was no good
é
reason
θ
for
ao
coming,
quadrado.
nobody came.
Calcula a
During the
derivada
first
do
day,
G
the savage lived alone
em relação
and
a U dá o
undisturbed.
quê?
Of the money which, on his first arrival, John had received for his personal expenses, most had been spent on his
O
equipment.
que dá?
Before leaving London, he had bought 4 viscous woolen blankets, rope and string, nails,
Alô?
glue, a few tools, matches, though he intended in due course to
2
make
vezes
fire,
menos seno de U.
some pots and pans,
Isso.
2 dozen packets of seeds,
Menos
and
2
10 kilograms
seno
of wheat.
de U.
No, not synthetic starch and
E a
cotton waste
derivada de
flour
U
substitute,
He
em
had
relação a
insisted,
even though it is
θ,
more nourishing.
2
but when it came
θ.
to pan-glandular biscuits and vitaminized beef surrogate, he had not been able to resist the shopman's persuasion.
Minha derivada
Looking
de
at the
G
tins now, he bitterly
relação a
reproached himself for
θ,
his weakness.
a derivada
Loathsome,
de G
civilized stuff.
em
He had
relação
made
a
up his
U
mind that he would never eat,
vezes a
even if he
derivada
was
de U
starved. That'll
em
teach them,
relação a
he
θ.
thought vindictively.
Menos
It would
2
also
seno
teach
de
him. He counted his
seno de
money.
U
The little that remained would be
vezes
enough, he
2
hoped, to tide him over the winter.
θ.
By next spring, his garden would be
Sei que
producing
tá
enough to
assim
make him
aqui, não.
independent of the outside world. Meanwhile, there
2
would always be
θ.
game. He had seen plenty of rabbits, and there were
Derivada
waterfowl
de
on the
G
ponds. He set to
em
work at once
relação a
to make a bow
θ,
and arrows. There were ash
fica
trees near the
menos
lighthouse, and for
4
arrow shafts, a whole copse full
seno
of beautifully straight hazel
de
saplings.
θ ao quadrado
He began by felling a young
vezes
ash,
θ. Eu passo
about
esse
6
θ
feet
para
one branch
frente,
stem, stripped off the bark,
menos
and
4
paring by
θ,
paring, shaved away the white
seno
wood, as old Midsummer had
de
taught
θ
him,
ao quadrado.
until he had a stave of his own height, stiff at the thickened center, lively and quick at the slender tips.
Entenderam essa parte?
Gave him an intense pleasure. After those weeks of
Entendi.
idleness in London with nothing to do, whenever he wanted anything
Meu
but to
H
press
de
a switch or
θ
turn a handle, it was pure
era
delight
seno de 2
to be doing
θ.
something that demanded skill and patience. He had almost finished whittling the
Seno
stave into shape when he
de
realized
2
with a start
θ.
that he was singing. Singing. It was as though, stumbling upon himself from the
Faço a
outside,
mesma
he had
coisa.
suddenly caught himself out, taken himself
Faço com o
flagrantly
seno,
at
sei
fault.
lá,
Guilty
de
of
V.
After all,
O meu
it was
V
not to sing and enjoy
é
himself
2
that he
θ.
had come here. It was
A
to
derivada
escape
de
further
H
contamination by the filth
em
of
relação a
civilized
V
life. It was to be purified
é
and
cosseno
made
de
good.
V.
It was actively to make
E a
amends.
derivada de
He
V
realized, to his
em
dismay,
relação a
absorbed
θ
in the whittling of his bow,
é
he had
2.
forgotten what he had sworn to himself
Juntando
he
os
would
dois,
constantly
derivada de
remember.
H em relação a θ,
And his own murderous
a
unkindness.
derivada de
And
H
those
em
loathsome
relação
twins
a
swarming like lice across the
V
ministry of her death,
vezes a
insulting with their
derivada
presence
de
not merely
V
his own grief and repentance,
em
but the
relação a
very gods
θ.
themselves.
Então dá cosseno de V
He had sworn unceasingly to make
vezes
amends.
2.
And here he was, sitting
Então é
happily
2
over his bow
cosseno
stave, singing, actually
em meu
singing.
V é
He went indoors,
2
opened the box
θ.
of mustard, and put some water to boil on the fire. Half an hour later, 3 Delta Minus land workers from one of the Putnam-Bokanovsky groups happened to be driving to
Calculei a
Ulster,
derivada
and
de G
at the top of the
aqui,
hill were astonished to see a young man standing outside the abandoned lighthouse,
a
stripped to the
derivada
waist,
de H
and hitting
aqui.
himself with a whip of knotted cords.
Meu F
His
era
back
G
was
vezes
horizontally
θ.
streaked with crimson, and from wheel to wheel ran thin trickles of blood. The driver of the lorry pulled up at the side of the road, and, with his 2 companions, stared open-mouthed at the extraordinary spectacle. 1, 2, 3. They counted the strokes.
Meu
After
F
the
de
8th, the
θ
young man interrupted his self-punishment to run to the wood's
era
edge
2
and there be
cosseno
violently sick.
de
When he had
θ ao
finished, he picked
quadrado
up the whip and began hitting himself again.
vezes o seno
10,
de
11,
2 θ, que eu
12,
escrevi como G de
whistled
θ
the driver, and his twins
vezes
were of the
H
same
de
opinion.
θ.
40.
Meu F' de θ,
3 days later,
eu
like
uso a regra
coffee
do
buzzards
produto,
settling on a corpse, the
derivada do
reporters came.
primeiro
Dry
vezes o
and hardened
segundo
over a slow fire of green wood,
mais
the
o
bow was ready.
primeiro
The savage was busy on his
vezes
arrow.
a derivada do
30 hazel
segundo.
sticks had been whittled and dried,
Derivada
tipped
do
with sharp
primeiro
nails, carefully knocked.
é menos
He had made a
4
raid one
θ
night on the Putnam poultry farm, and now
seno
had feathers enough to equip a
de
whole
θ
army.
ao
But was
quadrado
at work upon the feathering of his
vezes
shaft
o
that the
segundo,
first
que é
of the
seno
reporters found him.
de 2
Noiseless in his
θ
pneumatic shoes, the man came up
mais o
behind him.
primeiro,
Good morning, Mr. Savage.
que é 2
said,
cosseno
I'm the representative of
de
the
θ
hourly
ao
radio.
quadrado
Startled, as though by the bite of the
vezes a
snake,
derivada
the
do
savage sprang to
segundo,
his feet, scattering
que é
arrows, feathers,
cosseno
glue pot, and brush in all directions.
de 2
I beg
θ,
your pardon.
Said the reporter with genuine
mais
compunction.
precisamente
I had no intention.
2 cosseno de 2
The aluminium stovepipe hat in which he carried his wireless receiver and transmitter.
Então meu F' de
Excuse me for not
θ
taking it off,
He said,
it's a bit
menos
heavy.
4
Well, as I
θ
was saying, I am the representative
de
of the
θ ao
hourly...
quadrado.
What do you want?
asked the
vezes
savage,
seno de
scowling.
2
The
θ
reporter returned his most
mais
ingratiating smile.
4
Well, of course, our readers would be profoundly interested.
He put his head on one side. His smile became almost coquettish.
Just a few words from you, Mr. Savage.
And rapidly, with a series of ritual gestures, he uncoiled 2 wires connected to the
4
portable battery
cosseno de
buckled
θ
around
ao
his waist,
quadrado
plugged them simultaneously into the sides
vezes
of his
cosseno
aluminum
de
hat,
2
touched a
θ
spring on the crown, and antenna shot up into the air, touched another spring on the peak of the brim, and, like a jack-in-the-box, out jumped a microphone, and hung there, quivering, 6 inches in front of his nose.
E é
Pulled on
isso.
a pair of receivers over his ears, pressed a switch on the left side of the hat, and from within came a faint waspy
Entenderam?
buzzing. Turned a knob on the right,
Dúvidas?
and the buzzing was interrupted by a stethoscopic wheeze and crackle, by hiccups and sudden squeaks. Hello? He said to the microphone. Hello? Hello? A bell suddenly rang inside his hat. Is that you, Edsel? Primo Melon speaking. Yes, I got hold of him. Mr. Savage will now take the microphone and say a few words. Won't you, Mr. Savage? He looked up at the Savage with another of those winning smiles of his. Just tell our readers why you came here. What made you leave London?
Dúvida, gente?
Hold on, Edsel. So very suddenly. And of course that whip. The Savage started. How did they know about the whip? You're all crazy to know about the whip. And something about civilization. You know, the sort of stuff. What I think of the civilized girl. Just a few words, a very few. The Savage obeyed with a disconcerting literalness. 5 words he uttered, and no more. 5 words. The same as those he had said to Bernard about the arch-community songster of Canterbury. Hani, sons, eso, cena! And, seizing the reporter by the shoulder, he spun him round. The young man revealed himself invitingly well covered, aimed, and with all the force and accuracy of a champion foot and mouth baller.
Tá ok, professor S. Obrigado.
8 minutes later, a new edition of the
Vocês
Hourly
querem
Radio
tempo pra
was on
copiar ou
sale
não?
on the streets of London. Hourly Radio reporter has coccyx kicked by Mystery Savage.
Sim, professor, por favor. Oh, só
Sensation in Surrey. Sensation even in London, thought the reporter.
Dá
And on
print.
his return, he read the words.
Oi?
And a very painful sensation, what was more.
É só tirar print.
To his luncheon. Undeterred by that cautionary bruise on their colleagues' coccyx, 4 other reporters, representing the New York Times, the Frankfurt Four-Dimensional Continuum, the Fordian Science Monitor, and the Delta Mirror, called that afternoon
Próximo
at the Lighthouse
exercício.
and met with receptions of progressively increasing violence. From a safe distance, and still rubbing his buttocks, "Benighted fool!" shouted the man from the Fordian Science Monitor. "Why don't you take some soma? Get away!" The Savage shook his fist. The other retreated a few steps, then turned round again. "Evil's an unreality if you take a couple of grams. Kokakwa iatokai!" The tone was menacingly derisive. "Pain's a delusion!" "Oh, is it?" said the Savage.
Professor, tem um exercício que o senhor passou pra gente fazer em casa. Ele é o número 19 ou 20. Eu coloquei 19. É y igual a ln de t ao quadrado vezes raiz de t cúbico menos 5t.
He shot an arrow into the importunately nearest of them. There was a shrill yell,
Qual? Você falou
and the machine went
19?
rocketing up into the air.
Não,
with all
não é
the
da
acceleration
lista,
that
não.
its
Não
supercharger
sei se
could
é da
give.
lista. É um que o senhor passou
Kept their
pra
distance
gente treinar. Não
pra
consegui
fazer em
fazer.
casa.
Tiresome humming.
Isso.
Lembro.
He likened himself in his imagination to one of the suitors of the Maiden of Matsaki, unmoved and persistent among the winged
Ver se
vermin.
eu acho
The
ele.
Savage dug at what was to be his guard.
Eu acho que o senhor colocou como 20, mas eu coloquei como 19.
And flew away. For hours at a stretch, the sky above his head was empty and, but for the larks, silent. The weather was breathlessly hot. There was thunder in the air. He had dug all morning and was resting, stretched out along the floor. And suddenly, the thought of Lenina was a real presence, naked and tangible, saying, "Sweet," and "Put your arms round me." In shoes and
19?
socks,
Qual que é?
perfume. Impudent strumpet.
Esse, o 19.
Oh, her arms round his neck, the lifting of her breasts, her mouth. Eternity was in her
ln
lips
de
and
t ao
eyes.
quadrado
Lenina. No,
vezes
no,
raiz
no.
de t ao cubo
He
menos
sprang to his
5t.
feet and, half naked as he was, ran out of the house. At the edge of a heath stood a clump of hoary juniper bushes. He flung himself against them. He embraced not the smooth body of his desires, but an armful of green spikes. Sharp, with 1,000 points, they pricked him. He tried to think of poor Linda, breathless and dumb with her clutching hands and the unutterable terror in her eyes. Poor Linda, whom he had sworn to remember. But It was still the presence of Lenina that haunted him. Lenina, whom he had promised to forget. Even through the stab and sting of the juniper needles, his wincing flesh was aware of her, unescapably real.
Aqui eu não posso dividir isso em duas partes.
And if you wanted me to,
Uma F
didn't you?
de T
The whip was hanging on a nail by the door.
e uma G de T.
Against the arriving reporters. In a frenzy, the savage ran back to the house, seized it, whirled it. The knotted cords bit into his flesh. Strumpet! Strumpet! He shouted at every blow, as though it were Lenina. And how frantically, without knowing it, he wished it were.
De T ao quadrado.
Warm, scented, infamous Lenina that he was flogging thus.
F' de T.
And then, in a voice of
quem é
despair,
derivada da de fora,
forgive me,
aplicado na de
God.
dentro,
I'm bad, I'm wicked,
vezes a derivada da de
you
dentro.
strumpet, you strumpet! From his carefully constructed hide in the wood, 300 meters
O
away,
F' de
Darwin
T.
Bonaparte, the Feely
Quem que é derivada do
Corporation's most
LN?
expert big game photographer,
Não é
had
sobre
watched the
alguma
whole
coisa?
proceedings.
Então
Patience
fica
and
sobre
skill
T
had
ao
been
quadrado
He had spent 3 days
vezes
sitting inside the
derivada
hole
de
of
T
an
ao
artificial
quadrado,
oak.
2.
3 nights crawling on his belly through the heather,
Então é
hiding
2T
microphones in gorse bushes,
sobre
burying
T ao
wires in the
quadrado.
soft grey sand.
Cancelo
72 hours of profound
T,
discomfort.
fica
Now, the great
2
moment
sobre
had
T.
come. The greatest, Darwin Bonaparte had time to reflect as he moved among his instruments, the greatest since his taking of the famous, all-howling, stereoscopic Feely of the gorilla's
Minha G
wedding.
de T, T ao
Splendid,
cubo
he
menos
said to himself,
5T
as the savage started his astonishing
dentro da
performance.
raiz,
Splendid.
que é T ao
He
cubo
kept his
menos
telescopic cameras carefully aimed,
T
glued to their moving
elevado a meio.
clapped on a higher power to get a close-up
Meu
of
G'
the frantic and
de
distorted
T
face. Admirable.
é meio,
Switched over for half a minute to slow motion.
T ao
An
cubo
exquisitely
menos
comical effect, he promised
5T,
himself. Listened in, meanwhile, to
o
the blows,
expoente
the
é
groans,
meio,
the
tiro do
wild and raving words
expoente,
that were being recorded on the soundtrack for the
vezes a
film.
derivada do
Tried
de
the effect of a
dentro,
little amplification. Yes,
que é
it's decidedly
3T ao
Just
quadrado
like again, in a momentary lull, the shrill singing of
menos
the lark.
5.
Wished the savage would turn round
Então
so
fica
that he could get a good close-up of the blood on his
1
back.
sobre
And
2,
almost instantly,
T ao cubo menos
the
5T
accommodating fellow did turn around.
elevado a menos
He was able to
meios,
take a perfect
que
close-up.
multiplica 3T ao quadrado
Well, that was grand,
menos
said to
5.
himself when it was all over. Really grand. He mopped his face. When they had put in the Feely effects at the studio, it would be a wonderful film. Almost as good,
Então
thought
posso
Darwin
escrever
Bonaparte, as the
3T ao quadrado
sperm whale's
menos
love life.
5
That, by 4, was saying a
dividido
good
por
deal.
2. O que
12 days
está em
later,
cima
the savage of
está
Surrey
elevado a
had been
menos
released
meio, vai
and could
para
be seen
vai
and
pro
felt
denominador
in every
com
first-class
raiz.
Feely Palace in Western Europe.
Então,
The
T ao
effect of
cubo
Darwin
menos
Bonaparte's film was
5T
immediate and enormous. On the afternoon which followed the evening of its
dentro da
release,
raiz.
John's rustic solitude was suddenly broken by the arrival overhead of a great swarm of helicopters. He was digging in his garden, digging too in his own mind, laboriously turning up the substance of his thought, death. And he drove in his spade once, and again, and yet again. And all our yesterdays have lighted fools the way to dusty death.
Então, meu Y
Convincing thunder rumbled through the
era
wind.
F
He lifted another spade
T
from the ground.
vezes G de T.
Why had
Meu
she
Y
been allowed
linha
to
de
become
X,
gradually less than human, and
derivado
at
do
last
primeiro
he shuddered,
vezes
a
o
good
segundo
kissing carrion.
mais o
He planted his
primeiro
foot on his spade and
vezes
stamped
a derivada
fiercely
do
into the tough
segundo.
ground. As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. Thunder again. Words that proclaim themselves true, truer somehow than truth itself.
A derivada do primeiro deu 2 sobre t. 2 sobre t vezes o segundo, que é t ao cubo menos 5t tirando a raiz, mais o primeiro, ln de t ao quadrado, vezes a derivada do segundo, que deu 3t ao quadrado menos 5, sobre 2, t ao cubo menos 5t, dentro da raiz.
He looked up, startled from his digging, from his thoughts. Looked up in a dazzled bewilderment, his mind still wandering in that other world of truer than truth, still focused on the immensities of death and deity.
Não tem muito que mexer.
Looked up and saw close above him the swarm of hovering machines.
Posso escrever 2 t ao cubo menos 5t dentro da raiz dividido por t mais ln de... Não, deixa eu colocar o ln depois. Mais 3t ao quadrado menos 5 vezes ln de t ao quadrado dividido por 2 t ao cubo menos 5t dentro da raiz é isso. Ficou claro? Explica de novo.
The door and shook it at his tormentors. There was a yell of ironical.
Ficou claro, professor. Obrigada.
Menacingly, he advanced towards them. A woman cried out in fear. The line wavered at its most immediately threatened point, then stiffened again, stood firm. The consciousness of being in overwhelming force had given these sightseers a courage which the savage had not expected of them. Taken aback, he halted and looked round. "Why don't you leave me alone?" There was an almost plaintive note in his anger. "Have a few magnesium salted almonds," said the man who, if the savage were to advance, would be the first to be attacked. He held out a packet. "They're really very good, you know," he added, with a rather nervous smile of propitiation. "And the magnesium salts will help to keep you young." The savage ignored the offer. "What do you want with me?" he asked, turning from one grinning face to another. "What do you want with me?" "The whip," answered 100 voices confusedly. "Do the whipping stunt! Let's see the whipping stunt!" Then, in unison, and on a slow, heavy rhythm, "We want the whip!" shouted a group at the end of the line. "We want the whip!" Others at once took up the cry, and the phrase was repeated, parrot fashion, again and again, with an ever-growing volume of sound, until by the 7th or 8th reiteration, no other word was being spoken. "We want the whip!" They were all crying together.
Se tiver como, passa algum outro dever, outro exercício daquele de teta, eu tenho mais dificuldade nele. Igual aquele 23 da lista, mais ou menos.
About the 25th repetition, the proceedings were startlingly interrupted. Yet another helicopter had arrived from
O problema é ser teta.
hung poised above the crowd, then dropped.
Tipo, algum exercício tipo de o 23 da lista. Porque eu entendi a resolução, mas se eu for para pegar para fazer, eu acho que eu não daria conta de novo, não.
We want the whip! We want the whip! Broke out again in the same loud, insistent monotone. The door of the helicopter opened, and out stepped first a fair and ruddy-faced young man, then, in green velveteen shorts, white shirt, and jockey cap, a young woman. At the sight of the young woman, the savage started, recoiled, turned pale. The young woman stood, smiling at him, an uncertain, imploring,
Consegue fazer esse? F de θ igual a secante de θ de cubo.
Her lips moved. She was saying something, but the sound of her voice was covered by the loud, reiterated refrain of the sightseers. We want the whip! We want the whip! The young woman pressed both hands to her left side, and on that peach-bright, dull, beautiful face of hers appeared a strangely incongruous expression of yearning distress. Her blue eyes seemed to grow larger, brighter, and suddenly 2 tears rolled.
Uai, eu tenho que tentar, né?
Inaudibly, she spoke again.
Então vou tentar aqui, peraí.
With a quick, impassioned gesture, stretched out her arms towards the savage, stepped forward. We want the whip! We want... And all of a sudden, they had what they wanted. Strumpet! The savage had rushed at her like a madman. Fit you! Like a madman, he was slashing at her with his whip of small cords. Terrified, she had turned to flee, had tripped and fallen in the heather. Henry! Henry! She shouted, but her ruddy-faced companion had bolted out of harm's way behind the helicopter. With a whoop of delighted excitement, the line broke. There was a convergent stampede towards that magnetic center of attraction. Pain was a fascinating horror. Fry! Lechery! Fry! Frenzied, the savage slashed again. Hungrily they gathered round, pushing and scrambling like swine about the trough. Oh, the flesh! The savage ground his teeth. This time, it was on his shoulders that the whip descended. Kill it! Kill it! Drawn by the fascination of the horror of pain and, from within, impelled by that habit of cooperation, that desire for unanimity and atonement, which their conditioning had so ineradicably implanted in them, they began to mine the frenzy of his gestures, striking at one another as the savage struck at his own rebellious flesh, or at that plump incarnation of turpitude writhing in the heather at his feet. Kill it! Kill it! Kill it! The savage went on shouting. Then suddenly, somebody started singing, Orgy, porgy! And in a moment, they had all caught up the refrain and, singing, had begun to dance. Orgy, porgy, round and round and round, beating one another in 6/8 time. Orgy, porgy! It was after midnight when the last of the helicopters took its flight. Stupefied by so much, and exhausted by a long-drawn frenzy of sensuality,
Pronto.
the savage lay sleeping in the heather. The sun was already high.
Se o senhor quiser ir resolvendo.
He lay for a moment,
Não,
blinking
você
in
faz.
owlish incomprehension at the light.
Alguém conseguiu fazer já?
Suddenly remembered.
Eu já fiz mais ou menos a metade.
Oh my God!
Mas na hora que eu coloquei o meu θ ao cubo como G.
Covered his eyes.
E aí eu derivei ele, ficou 3θ ao quadrado.
That evening,
Aí na hora que eu derivei o F' de θ, eu coloquei secante de G.
was a dark cloud.
Aí agora que eu tô fazendo a derivada dela.
The description of last night's orgy of atonement had been in all the papers. Savage! Called the first arrivals as they alighted from their machine. Mr. Savage! There was no answer. The door of the lighthouse was ajar. They pushed it open and walked into a shuttered twilight. Through an archway on the further side of the room, they could see the bottom of the staircase that led up to the higher floors. Just under the crown of the arch dangled a pair of feet. Mr. Savage? Slowly, very slowly, like two unhurried compass needles, the feet turned towards the right. North, northeast, east, southeast, south, southwest. Then paused, and after a few seconds, turned as unhurriedly back towards the left. South, southwest, south, southeast, east.
This has been a presentation of BBC Audiobooks America.
Professora, a minha deu seno de θ ao cubo vezes 3 θ ao quadrado sobre cosseno de θ ao cubo elevado a 2.
By BBC Audiobooks America. All rights reserved.
Seno de θ ao cubo vezes 3 θ ao quadrado sobre cosseno de θ ao cubo ao quadrado. Aí eu coloquei só os parênteses no θ ao cubo e coloquei ao quadrado.
Oi?
Não, pode ser de jeito. É porque eu coloquei o primeiro parêntese, em vez de ser no cosseno, eu coloquei entre o θ ao cubo.
Cosseno ao quadrado de θ ao cubo.
Isso.
Nada, não é mesmo?
É.
Vou fazer aqui rapidinho. Meu f de θ é secante de θ ao cubo. Meu f' de θ é a derivada da secante aplicada no θ ao cubo vezes a derivada do θ ao cubo. Derivada da secante é a secante de θ ao cubo vezes a tangente de θ ao cubo vezes a derivada de θ ao cubo 3θ ao quadrado. É isso a resposta. Aí eu acho que você desenvolveu mais um pouco. A secante é 1 sobre cosseno. A tangente é seno de θ ao cubo sobre cosseno de θ ao cubo sobre 3θ ao quadrado, que dá o que você falou. Perfeito.
Ok.
Eduardo, fica incompleto se eu deixar só secante de θ ao cubo vezes tangente de θ ao cubo vezes 3θ elevado ao quadrado, ou não?
Não. Geralmente eu colocaria o θ na frente. 3θ ao quadrado, secante de θ ao cubo, vezes tangente de θ ao cubo. Tranquilo?
Certo, então.
Mais alguma dúvida? Mais alguma dúvida?
Por mim, não.
Vou passar então o que vocês têm que fazer para a próxima semana. Aqui é esse capítulo 3. Matemática universitária, cálculo integral. O que vocês acharam das videoaulas que eu passei? Tá num nível alto, muito rápido, muito devagar? Alô?
Tá legal. Por enquanto tá legal.
Então tá bom. Eu separei as videoaulas do mesmo canal e eu separei um pouco do Grings, que é bem mais devagar. Então vamos lá para a página 8. Aqui tem o link. Vocês estão vendo? Dá para enxergar aí tranquilo? Ele vai falar mais ou menos o que fala na playlist. No vídeo 2 ele vai pegar um exemplo físico, deslocamento e a velocidade, relaciona, consegue que a área vai ser integral. Depois tem o teorema fundamental do cálculo, que relaciona as derivadas com integral. Significa que se eu pegar uma função f e integrar e depois derivar, eu volto nela, e a segunda parte dele, que vai entrar o conceito de primitiva, e com a primitiva eu consigo calcular a integral. Aí depois vai ter alguns exemplos, calculando a integral definida, depois as propriedades da integral indefinida, igual a derivada da soma é a soma da derivada. Aqui é a mesma coisa para integral. Se eu somar duas funções é a mesma coisa que eu integrar ela separado e depois somar. E se eu estiver integrando k vezes a função, eu posso jogar a constante para fora vezes a integral da função. Aí vai ter as integrais básicas, que é relacionado com as derivadas. Aí depois vai ter mais exemplos. Depois uns exemplos não tão elementares. Depois ele vai pegar a função que não tem como integrar e deriva para calcular a derivada. Aí aqui também é mudança, tipo mudança de variável na integração. Aqui também é mudança de variável. Aí vai entrar um conceito mais avançado, que é de integral por partes. Quando eu quiser calcular alguma coisa tipo x seno de x, o x ao quadrado vezes elevado a x, eu vou utilizar a integral por partes. Aí tem alguns exemplos e acaba. Aí eu vou passar também uma lista para vocês ir treinando. Alguma dúvida?
Não.
Querem que eu faça mais alguma coisa ou tá bom por hoje?
Professor, isso tudo que o senhor explicou é para a próxima aula?
Isto. Correto.
Tá bom por hoje. Vamos começar já, Lincoln, para a próxima.
É porque a nossa matéria é condensada. Seria um semestre, só que agora é em 2 meses.
É verdade.
Você deve ter pego o quê? 2 ou 3 disciplinas, não foi?
Foi.
Peguei 4.
4? Aí é suicídio.
É, parece que já tá no final do semestre. Né?
Não, 4 é muita coisa, porque 4 seria 8.
Sim.
Pois é, professor, é por isso que eu achei que o semestre já tá acabando, né? Já começou uma semana, tá tenso, viu?
Tá, imagino, é muita coisa. Na próxima etapa você pega menos. Certo, então, pessoal. Aí qualquer coisa vocês vão postando dúvida no WhatsApp ou aqui no chat. E a gente vai conversando. Muito obrigado e até a próxima quarta.